In a move that stunned diplomats and energy markets alike, Donald Trump announced what he called a global oil doctrine. According to him, any oil crisis anywhere on the planet is now automatically a U.S. military concern. Supporters cheered as if he had solved energy security worldwide, but the global reaction was immediate panic. For the first time, a sitting U.S. president explicitly treated the natural resources of the world as under American control, essentially turning the planet into what he called America's gas station. Wolf would immediately analyze the implications. This is not policy, it is spectacle elevated to a doctrine. When leadership treats the globe as a personal resource, the predictable structures of international diplomacy collapse. Markets, alliances, and strategic calculations all begin to function under the shadow of impulse rather than law. Oil markets reacted violently. Prices surged, futures contracts oscillated wildly, and energy traders scrambled to hedge positions. Economies dependent on stable oil flows from Europe to Asia suddenly faced extreme uncertainty. Governments that had long relied on established protocols realized that these were now irrelevant. The world's most vital resource could be claimed, militarily enforced, at the whim of one individual. China and Russia immediately accelerated plans to bypass the U.S. dollar in energy trade, secretly moving toward alternative agreements and hedging strategies. Wolf would comment, "When impulse drives policy, rational actors must adapt instantly. The global oil doctrine is less about oil itself and more about the unpredictability of power exercised without restraint." Meanwhile, ordinary citizens across the globe watched in disbelief. Social media exploded with memes depicting Trump pumping oil from the globe into a giant U.S. tank, while analysts debated whether this was a bold strategy or an unprecedented display of global hubris. One thing was clear: Trump had transformed the simple commodity of oil into a symbol of global anxiety, and the world had no idea what would happen next. Trump's declaration sent shockwaves far beyond Washington. Financial markets, already jittery from prior geopolitical uncertainties, plunged as traders attempted to interpret the consequences of a global oil doctrine. Oil futures spiked and fell in unpredictable cycles. Energy stocks wavered, and investors scrambled to adjust portfolios. Wolf would analyze, "Economic systems are designed to manage rational risks. When a single leader converts the globe into his personal asset, predictability vanishes. Fear becomes the primary currency." Across Europe, governments convened emergency briefings. Energy ministers debated how to respond to the possibility that any disruption in oil supply could now justify U.S. military intervention. Companies dependent on global oil faced immediate uncertainty. Logistics chains were suddenly under the shadow of military risk, and nations reliant on energy imports began reconsidering security strategies. In Asia, China accelerated efforts to diversify oil trade and reduce dependence on the U.S. dollar. Russian officials convened emergency OPEC strategy sessions, exploring partnerships with Middle Eastern and South American producers to counterbalance American overreach. Both nations understood a stark truth: Trump's impulsive declaration could instantly disrupt global energy markets if left unchecked. Social media amplified the panic. Memes and viral commentary spread across platforms portraying Trump literally turning the planet into a U.S. gas station, with captions like "Global oil crisis, call Trump." Analysts and commentators debated whether this doctrine was enforceable or purely performative, but perception had already altered reality. Wolf would emphasize, "In modern geopolitics, perception can create consequences as immediate and severe as action itself. Markets, alliances, and human lives respond to narrative even before policy manifests." By the day's end, the world had learned an unsettling lesson. Under Trump, no oil crisis is merely regional, no market disruption is insignificant, and no nation can assume energy security. The planet itself had become a chessboard, and the king was unpredictable, impulsive, and fully aware of the global stage. As the global oil doctrine reverberated across the world, China and Russia moved swiftly and quietly. Both nations recognized the existential implications of Trump's declaration. If any oil disruption anywhere could trigger U.S. military intervention, reliance on the U.S. dollar for energy trade had become a strategic vulnerability. Beijing accelerated agreements with Middle Eastern and African suppliers, bypassing the dollar and creating alternative payment channels. Moscow, long wary of American dominance in energy markets, doubled down on bilateral deals and leveraged OPEC influence to safeguard its exports. Wolf would observe, Impulse-driven leadership forces others to act rationally, but in ways that can fundamentally alter global systems. By treating the planet as a personal gas station, Trump has catalyzed a reorientation of energy trade, alliances, and economic influence. Global markets felt the immediate effect. Non-dollar oil trades increased, futures markets adjusted to new supply expectations, and investors worried about the destabilization of U.S. financial influence over energy flows. Nations dependent on traditional trade routes and the dollar scrambled to adapt, fearing both economic and geopolitical fallout. Diplomats worked overtime, balancing subtle warnings with public neutrality. Beijing and Moscow were careful not to provoke confrontation, yet their actions sent a clear signal. The era of unquestioned U.S. control over global energy markets might be coming to an end. Wolf would comment, "This is a structural shift. One impulsive declaration has accelerated decades of geopolitical evolution in mere hours. Policy now responds to impulse, and global stability is instantly recalculated." Meanwhile, ordinary citizens followed the drama through news and social media. Memes depicted Trump pumping oil from the Middle East into U.S. tanks, while analysts debated whether these maneuvers were symbolic, strategic, or dangerously literal. The world had entered a new reality. Energy markets, geopolitics, and global security were now at the mercy of an unpredictable leader whose whims dictated strategy, and the ripple effects would be felt for years to come. Following Trump's declaration, energy markets erupted into chaos. Crude oil prices surged unpredictably, futures contracts oscillated wildly, and trading floors buzzed with alarm. Companies reliant on steady global oil flows scrambled to hedge risks, while analysts warned of cascading effects across energy-dependent sectors. Wolf would observe, economic systems rely on predictability and structured risk. When the head of a major power treats the globe as his personal energy portfolio, financial stability is no longer possible. From Asia to Europe, nations faced immediate uncertainty. Oil-dependent economies braced for supply shocks. Contracts, pipelines, and storage logistics became fraught with risk, all triggered by a single impulsive statement. Ordinary citizens soon felt the consequences in rising gasoline prices and higher energy costs. Meanwhile, social media amplified the panic. Memes of Trump pumping oil from the world into a U.S. tank went viral, alongside posts debating whether this was an enforceable policy or ego-driven theater. The spectacle itself became a market factor. Wolf would add, when perception carries as much weight as policy, markets respond not to law but to the drama of leadership. The lesson was unmistakable. Trump's impulse-driven doctrine had turned a global commodity into a symbol of uncertainty, destabilizing economies in real time. No market, no alliance, and no energy-dependent nation could ignore it. Europe and North America watched nervously. NATO convened emergency sessions to discuss the unprecedented doctrine. Military leaders debated whether this declaration implied enforceable action anywhere oil crises emerged, while diplomats scrambled to reassure allies that unpredictability did not equate to aggression. Yet no one could be certain. Wolf would analyze, institutions are designed to manage predictable threats. Impulse-driven policy transforms routine diplomacy into constant adaptation. The world now responds to personality rather than precedent. Even within the U.S., defense planners quietly assessed contingency scenarios. Every tweet, rally, or public statement could escalate tension. Allies began reviewing strategic energy reserves, military readiness, and diplomatic approaches, understanding that Trump's whims now dictated global stability. Venezuela, already destabilized from previous interventions, became the focus of regional anxiety. Neighboring nations braced for ripple effects from energy disruption to possible U.S. military action. Regional alliances issued carefully worded statements urging diplomacy, but uncertainty remained. Wolf would comment, Venezuela is a warning. One individual's impulse can destabilize an entire region. Nations now calculate risk not from history, but from the unpredictability of a single leader's theatrics. Markets and citizens across Latin America experienced immediate consequences. Trade disruptions, rising fuel costs, and political anxiety reflected the reach of Trump's doctrine. The region was reminded that energy policy under an impulsive leader could become existential. The global oil doctrine became the story of the day on social media. Memes, viral videos, and commentary spread like wildfire. Some celebrated Trump's decisiveness, while others warned of the dangerous precedent of treating global resources as personal property. Wolf would emphasize narrative itself is now a driver of consequence. Leadership is not just policy, it is spectacle, amplified by media, influencing markets, diplomacy, and public perception simultaneously. The feedback loop of online engagement, viral imagery, and public panic transformed a statement into a tangible global risk factor. Citizens, investors, and world leaders reacted to the story itself as much as the policy. In Beijing, planners accelerated non-dollar oil trade, securing alternative supply chains and stockpiles to bypass U.S. influence. Energy ministers coordinated with private companies, ensuring domestic needs were insulated from the unpredictability of U.S. unilateral action. Wolf would note, impulse creates opportunity for structural change. One leader's theatrics can catalyze decades of realignment in hours. China's rapid response reflects rational actors adapting to irrational leadership. The message was clear. Global energy strategy would now include contingency for U.S. unpredictability. Markets and governments adjusted accordingly, quietly rewriting rules that had governed global energy for decades. Moscow mirrored China's moves, leveraging OPEC influence and negotiating bilateral energy agreements. Russia sought to maintain stability in exports while positioning itself to exploit U.S. unpredictability. Wolf would explain, when impulse dominates, other powers respond structurally. Strategic adaptation becomes both a shield and a tool for influence. Trump's theatrics are forcing permanent shifts in global power balances. Meanwhile, analysts warn that any misstep could escalate tensions further, creating a volatile environment where miscalculation could spark conflict. By the week's end, the consequences of Trump's global oil doctrine were unmistakable. Markets had stabilized partially, but volatility remained elevated. Nations quietly recalibrated alliances, energy trade was permanently realigned, and citizens felt anxiety over global resource security. Wolf would conclude, leadership driven by impulse transforms reality itself. The planet's energy, once managed through institutions and agreements, is now subject to the whims of spectacle. Markets, alliances, and citizens are forced into constant adaptation, and uncertainty has become permanent. The doctrine had demonstrated that the world could no longer rely on predictability. Trump had made energy not just an economic factor, but a geopolitical weapon, and the ripples of his impulsive declaration would shape global affairs for years to come.